Burke's behavior, sibling psychology and witness analysis. An investigative examination of demeanor, coping, and interview dynamics. Part 1. The body as evidence. On the third day of his interviews in 1998, Detective Tom Haney noticed something that stuck with him. He wasn't a psychologist, he said so directly, but he watched carefully as the questions turned toward JonBenet and the circumstances surrounding her death. Haney observed that Burke's physical demeanor shifted noticeably. The boy, then 9 years old, curled himself into a chair, not sitting upright as he had on the first 2 days, but withdrawing inward, drawing his legs up, settling into something close to a fetal position. Haney described it as a real struggle, a real difficult time. This observation matters not because it proves anything in isolation, but because it reveals what psychological research tells us about children under interrogative stress. The body communicates what the mind may not be able to articulate. A child's physical retreat from space, the literal compression of the self, is a recognized response to cognitive or emotional overload. It can signal distress, dissociation, or the effort required to maintain emotional control. When Haney later asked Patsy whether she had noticed similar changes in Burke, she did not deny it. Instead, she redirected toward her parental interpretation. Burke was in therapy, she explained. His therapist had told her something that made sense to her as a mother, that Burke might be trying to hold everything together, to appear strong for his parents, when what he probably needed was to let whatever he was carrying out. She said she had noticed this tendency in him, but when Haney pressed further, when he asked if it seemed like Burke knew more than he was saying, Patsy again pivoted. She conceded that in their conversations, when friends called, when he encountered media confrontation, these things certainly affected him. But as for knowing something specific about what happened to his sister, Patsy's answer was straightforward. As far as something about who did it, I don't think he knows. I mean, he would say. The logic of that statement carries its own weight. A 9-year-old who knew something Patsy seemed to believe would simply tell. Children, in her understanding of child development, lacked the sophistication to maintain a prolonged secret about something of that magnitude. It was a reasonable assumption for a mother to make, until one considers what developmental psychology actually tells us about children's capacity for concealment, context awareness, and reactive trauma responses. Part 2. The architecture of stress response. To understand what might be happening with Burke during these interviews, it helps to understand what we know about how children respond to investigative questioning in high-stakes situations. The literature is clear on one point. Children are not small adults. Their cognitive architecture is still forming. Their sense of legal jeopardy, of social consequence, of how their words might be interpreted, all of this is underdeveloped relative to adults. But something else is also true, and it complicates the narrative. Children are highly attuned to the emotional temperatures around them. They read parental anxiety with extraordinary precision. They sense when a question is actually an accusation. They understand, at an intuitive if not conscious level, that the adults asking them questions are trying to determine whether someone in their intimate family circle is responsible for something terrible. In the Ramsey case, Burke would have absorbed several layers of information by 1998. He had lived through the immediate aftermath of his sister's death. He had heard his parents and lawyers discuss the investigation with increasing adversity. He had felt himself becoming part of the investigative focus. As early as 1997, even before the 1998 interviews, questions had begun circling back to him, to what he might have known or experienced. His parents had placed him in therapy, an acknowledgement that this situation wasn't something a child could simply process without professional support. Tom Haney's observation of Burke's physical contraction during the interview is, in this context, a window into the accumulated weight the boy was carrying. The fetal position, the metaphorical return to an earlier stage of development, to a time before this trauma occurred, can be read as a literal compression of self in response to an unbearable moment. What's worth noting is what Haney did not report. He did not describe Burke as evasive in the typical sense. He did not describe lying or clear deception. He described distress and difficulty. He described a child struggling to maintain composure. These are not the same thing as evidence of guilt, but they are evidence of something. A child in psychological crisis, trying to navigate a situation that exceeded his emotional resources. Part 3. Parental Interpretation and Therapeutic Framing. Patsy's response to Haney's observation is instructive. Rather than dismissing it, she contextualized it through the lens of professional guidance. Burke had been in therapy with Dr. Jaffe, a child therapist. She was in regular contact with the therapist. She was receiving guidance on how to interpret her son's behavior, how to understand his coping mechanisms, how to support his recovery. According to Patsy's account in her 1998 interview, Dr. Jaffe had explained to her that Burke was likely trying to hold it together and be real strong for John and me. This is a classic description of what clinicians call parentified behavior, when a child takes on emotional responsibility for the adults around them, managing not their own emotional needs, but the projected needs of their parents. It's a recognized trauma response in families under extreme stress, particularly in families with resources, to seek therapy and articulate these dynamics in clinical language. The therapeutic narrative that Patsy introduced becomes important for understanding how she was interpreting her son's behavior. She was not seeing a child who was lying or hiding knowledge. She was seeing a child trying to protect his parents by appearing functional, by controlling his emotional expression, by demonstrating strength. The therapist, in her telling, had essentially validated this interpretation. The boy was handling this the way that a child copes best with the death of a very close family member, according to Patsy's reference to Dr. Jaffe. But there is a tension embedded in this narrative, and it's one that bears examination from an investigative standpoint. Patsy was simultaneously asserting two different things. 1. Burke was so distressed, so traumatized by his sister's death, that he required professional therapeutic support. He was visibly struggling during interviews. He was withdrawn, quiet, careful. 2. Burke was fine. He was coping well. He was adjusting well to the move, making friends, getting good grades. The therapist said he was handling the trauma appropriately. These statements are not necessarily contradictory. Children can be both troubled and functionally stable at the same time. But they point to the interpretive lens Patsy was applying. She was framing Burke's behavior through a lens of victimhood. Burke as a child traumatized by his sister's death, as a child whose emotional responses were best understood as grief processing rather than as responses to interrogative stress. This framing is self-protective. It provides an explanation for any unusual behavior, any evasiveness, any apparent knowledge of details. Part 4. The Limits of Parental Perception. When Haney pushed further, when he asked Patsy directly whether Burke might know more than he was saying, her responses became more nuanced and more revealing. She acknowledged that Burke seemed to be keeping something in, that something seemed to be affecting him. But she pivoted back to her core assertion. Whatever was affecting him, it was not knowledge of who killed his sister. The exchange that followed is worth examining closely. Haney employed a basic, logical constraint. If both Patsy and John said they didn't do it, and neither said they staged the scene, then the only other person in the house was Burke. It's a logical trap, in some sense. It uses absence to create presence, or at least the possibility of presence. Patsy's response was immediate and pointed. And the murderer. She was asserting a fifth possibility that Haney's logic had not accounted for: an intruder, an unknown actor. But her invocation of the murderer as a separate entity from her family, as something external, something other, is itself a psychological marker. She was drawing a boundary between family and killer, asserting that these categories could not overlap. When Haney pressed on, asking whether Burke could have been involved, Patsy offered several justifications. He was 9 or 10 years old. He loved his sister. He had been raised in a loving family without violence. These are reasonable parental assertions, the kind a parent would naturally make in defense of their child. But they are also assertions made in the context of a child being questioned about his possible involvement in his sister's death. What's notable is what Patsy did not say. She did not provide specific, detailed alibis for Burke. She did not describe his exact whereabouts throughout the morning. She did not provide minute-by-minute accounts of his behavior and state. Instead, she offered character evidence. He loved her. He was nonviolent by nature. He couldn't have done such a thing. When Haney asked whether it could have been an accident, Patsy's response shifted. She said, "I don't know." There is a pause in the transcript before the dash. It's a moment of hesitation, of uncertainty. She was being asked to consider a scenario that she apparently had not fully considered. An accident. Not an intentional act, but an unintended event that escalated beyond anyone's expectation or capacity to control. This hesitation is worth noting, because it suggests that Patsy's mental model of what happened had not, until that moment, seriously entertained this possibility. Her defense of Burke had focused on character, on who he was as a person, on his incapability of intentional harm. But the question of accident engages a different psychological and legal category. An accident presumes no intent, and intent, in some ways, is the hinge upon which guilt turns in legal terms. Patsy's "I don't know" in response to the accident question suggests a moment where her parental certainties were briefly suspended by the logical possibility Haney was proposing. Part 5. Interview Technique and Child Vulnerability. The 1998 interviews with Burke, which took place over 3 days, raise important questions about how children should be questioned in sensitive investigations. This is not to suggest that law enforcement acted improperly. It is to suggest that the very structure of a formal investigative interview, especially one that lasts for 3 days and involves detailed questioning about a family member's death, is inherently stressful for a child. Consider the context. Burke was 9 or 10 years old when he was formally interviewed in June 1998. More than a year had passed since his sister's death. He had lived through an extraordinarily public investigation. He had become, in some media accounts, a figure of suspicion. He knew that detectives wanted to talk to him. He was removed from his family and placed in an interview environment with unfamiliar adults, asking him detailed questions about his sister, about the morning she died, about his own actions and recollections. Developmental psychology tells us that children of this age have several competing limitations. They have limited ability to distinguish between what they directly experienced and what they were told happened. They have limited capacity to resist suggestion. They are highly motivated to please authority figures, particularly adults in official capacities. They struggle with the temporal sequencing of events. They can become confused about the difference between what they did, what they might have done, and what they imagined doing. And perhaps most importantly, they are acutely aware of whether their words are pleasing or displeasing to the adults around them. Over 3 days, the questions escalated. Haney noted that the first 2 days involved pretty basic questions, but on the 3rd day, when the focus shifted to JonBenet and her death, Burke's entire physical presentation changed. The change was visible, dramatic enough that a trained investigator noted it and later asked Patsy about it. This suggests that by the 3rd day, Burke understood the weight of what was being asked. He understood that he was being questioned as a possible suspect or as a possible witness to something of grave importance. There is a question worth asking in retrospect. What did Burke understand about the investigative process? Did he understand that he could refuse to answer? Did he understand that his mother's lawyer might have advised against these interviews? Did he understand the legal implications of what he was saying? Probably not fully on all counts. Children of 9 or 10 rarely do. What seems more likely is that Burke understood something simpler and more immediate, that the adults around him were looking for answers about his sister, that he was part of that inquiry, and that his words mattered. That understanding, in the absence of legal sophistication, is enough to produce the kind of stress response that Haney observed: the physical withdrawal, the fetal position, the apparent struggle. Part 6. Sibling Dynamics and the Shadow of Presence. Understanding Burke's role in this investigation also requires understanding sibling dynamics in the context of family trauma. JonBenet was the younger sibling. She was described as the golden child: beautiful, talented, successful in pageants, beloved. Burke was 9 or 10 years older. He was at the age where older siblings often occupy a different social and developmental space from younger ones. He was approaching adolescence. He had his own interests, his own life trajectory, separate from his sister's. In interviews, Patsy was asked about the relationship between the children. She described them as close, but she also acknowledged minor conflicts. JonBenet might step on his Lego construction, and he would be upset. But no real conflict, no violence, no aggression. In Patsy's account, they inhabited different worlds that occasionally overlapped, but did not genuinely clash. Yet in the aftermath of JonBenet's death, Burke became, by necessity, the shadow presence in every analysis of what happened. He was the only other child in the house. He was the only other person who could potentially provide evidence about the morning's events. He was the only sibling left, which meant that all parental attention, all investigative focus, all the unresolved grief and trauma of JonBenet's death was refracted through the lens of his presence or absence, his knowledge or ignorance, his involvement or innocence. This is a particular kind of psychological burden for a child. It is not the burden of having done something wrong necessarily, but the burden of being implicated, simply by being there, by being alive when one's sibling was not. It is a burden that compounds with time, with media speculation, with parental anxiety. In Patsy's accounts of Burke's behavior and emotional state, one hears a mother trying to protect her son from this burden. When she says he was trying to be strong for his parents, she is acknowledging that he had absorbed parental need and subordinated his own emotional needs to it. When she describes his therapy, she is locating his distress in his sibling's death rather than in any other cause. When she defends him against accusation, she is drawing a boundary between him and the investigation, asserting his separateness from the event that had consumed their family. But the investigation itself did not respect those boundaries. The logic of who was in the house, who could have been present, who had opportunity, all of this mathematics inevitably pointed toward Burke. He was 9 years old, the oldest child, the only other person. The investigation structure forced him into a position of relevance, whether he welcomed it or not. Part 7. Memory, Trauma, and Reliability. When children are questioned about traumatic events, especially events involving a family death, the reliability of their memories becomes an important consideration. This is not because children lie intentionally, but because trauma and memory do not interact in straightforward ways. In the weeks and months following a family death, a child's memories become layered. There is the original experience, whatever the child directly witnessed or did, but there are also the conversations that come after, the narratives that adults construct to help themselves and each other understand what happened. There are the media accounts that the child absorbs, even if indirectly. There are the therapeutic conversations, the police interviews, the family discussions. All of these create a palimpsest of memory, where what the child directly experienced becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish from what the child heard, saw reported, or absorbed through adult conversation. By the time Burke was formally interviewed in 1998, this process had been ongoing for more than a year. He had lived in this investigative environment for months. He had had his own interview sessions. His parents had discussed the case obsessively. His sister had been the subject of constant media attention. The home itself would have been different, the space reorganized, the family structure altered, the emotional tenor transformed. In this context, when Burke was asked to recall details about that morning, when he woke, what he did, what he heard or saw, he was not recovering pure, pristine memories. He was reconstructing narratives within a context where those narratives had already been constructed many times by many people. Patsy, when asked about Burke's knowledge and memory, asserted that she had spoken to him extensively about these questions. She said, "We are going to find out who did this to JonBenet. He's been in counseling." She framed their conversations as part of a family project to understand what happened. But in the context of investigative psychology, these conversations are also conversations that shape memory, that create expectancies, that can inadvertently suggest narratives to a child. None of this is to suggest to wrongdoing. It is simply to recognize that by 1998, the question of what Burke remembered, what he knew, what he was telling investigators, all of this was inseparable from the overlapping layers of conversation, media narrative, therapeutic processing, and family trauma response that had accumulated around him. Part 8. Behavioral Patterns and Coping Mechanisms. In her interviews, Patsy described Burke's behavior in the context of how he was coping with his sister's death. But it's worth examining what behavioral changes she actually noted, not in terms of whether they prove anything definitively, but in terms of what they reveal about his psychological state. She noted that he had become a little more cautious. He looked around to see if anyone was parked where they shouldn't be parked. He locked doors when coming in and going out. These are heightened security behaviors. They suggest a child who had internalized threat, who was monitoring his environment for danger, who understood that something bad could happen. Were these behaviors the result of his sister's death, creating a general sense of vulnerability in the family? Or were they something more specifically connected to his own awareness or anxiety? Patsy interpreted them as the former, as grief responses, as trauma responses, as appropriate caution given that a family member had been killed in their home. But the behaviors themselves, the vigilance, the door locking, the surveillance of the environment, are the kinds of behaviors that can also emerge in children who are anxious about discovery, who are hyper-aware of police presence, who sense that they are being investigated. Again, this is not to assert that this is what was happening with Burke. It is to say that the same behavioral presentation can be read multiple ways, and that parents naturally read their children's behavior in the most protective frame available. When Tom Haney asked about the interview process and how Burke was afterward, Patsy reported that Burke had said it was the most boring thing I ever done in my life. This is a child's assessment. It suggests that the 3-day interview, from Burke's perspective, did not feel like an interrogation so much as it felt like tedium. But it could also be a child's way of minimizing an experience that had been stressful, of asserting that it hadn't been a big deal, of deflating something that had been significant. Patsy consulted with Dr. Schuler, another name for the therapist, or possibly referring to someone else involved in the interviews, and he apparently told her that Burke's statement, that the interview was boring, suggested that he wasn't too traumatized over it. Again, Patsy's framework interprets this as positive, as evidence that Burke had handled the interview well, that his distress was not overwhelming. But the statement could also be read as evidence of something else: a child who had learned to manage his affect, who knew how to, present as untroubled, who had absorbed the message that he should not appear to be traumatized. Part 9. The question of knowledge. One of the most persistent questions in the investigative framing of Burke is not whether he did anything, but what he knew. Patsy was repeatedly asked whether Burke knew more than he was saying. She defended him against this suggestion, but her defenses were themselves suggestive. She insisted that Burke would tell if he knew something. She said she had asked him directly. She said that doctors and therapists had explored these questions. She said she was confident that whatever he knew, he would share. But in making these assertions, Patsy was also acknowledging that the question was reasonable, that it was plausible to ask whether a 9-year-old who lived in the house where his sister died, who was in therapy, who was being questioned by police, might be concealing knowledge. What's interesting is the language of confession and revelation that frames Patsy's responses. She describes having asked Burke about these things, having discussions, having conversations where therapists were exploring if he remembered anything. The frame is one of knowledge recovery, of trying to help him remember, to process, to disclose. But it's also a frame that could be creating pressure on a child to meet certain expectations, to provide the answers that adults believe should be available. When Haney pressed the logical argument that if neither parent did it, and neither parent staged the scene, then the only other person was Burke, Patsy's response was to invoke the intruder. There was another possibility that Haney's logic had not accommodated: a person from outside the family. But once that external possibility was on the table, it shifted the entire investigative frame. It meant that any behavior by Burke, any apparent knowledge, any anxiety or caution could be interpreted as responses to being present at a crime committed by an unknown actor, rather than as responses to his own involvement. This is the space where Patsy positioned her son. She acknowledged his anxiety, his caution, his apparent knowledge of something. But she located that knowledge and anxiety outside the circle of family culpability. Burke was traumatized, yes. Burke was affected, yes. But Burke was affected by what happened to his sister, not by what he did. Part 10. The paradox of innocence assertion. Parents defending their children against suspicion face a particular rhetorical and logical challenge. They must simultaneously acknowledge that their child is affected by the investigation, that the child is traumatized, anxious, in need of therapy, while asserting that this effect does not indicate guilt. The child's emotional disturbance is real, but it springs from loss, not from culpability. Patsy navigated this paradox by invoking character, family values, and psychological expertise. Burke was nonviolent because he was raised in a nonviolent family. Burke could not have intentionally harmed his sister because of who he was as a person. Burke's distress should be understood as grief processing, according to therapeutic experts. Burke would tell the truth if he knew something, because he was raised to tell the truth. These are all parental assertions. They are not evidence in any forensic sense, but they are the assertions that a mother would make in the position of defending her child against the logic of elimination. The logic that says, if you didn't do it, and your other parent didn't do it, then you did. What's notable is the strength and consistency of Patsy's defense. She did not waffle. She did not hedge. When Haney asked, "Could it have been an accident?" she briefly hesitated, but then she reasserted her position. She was not willing to entertain the possibility that Burke might have been involved in any way, accidental or otherwise. She drew a firm boundary between her son and the investigation, but that boundary was being tested constantly. The investigation structure forced questions back toward Burke. The media speculation circled around him. The family's internal conversations had to address the possibility, even if in the form of defensive rejection. And Burke, a 9-year-old boy, was left navigating an environment where his possible guilt was the unspoken subtext of many conversations. Part 11. Narrative Control and Family Coherence. One of the mechanisms through which families survive systemic trauma is through narrative control. A family develops a story about what happened, why it happened, and what it means. This story helps to organize chaos, to provide meaning, to protect members from the worst implications of the evidence or the investigation. In the Ramsey family's case, the dominant narrative was intruder theory. An unknown assailant entered the house, encountered JonBenet, and the situation escalated. This narrative protects the entire family from investigative suspicion because it places responsibility outside the family circle. It also creates a coherent explanation for the physical evidence, for the absence of clear alibis, for the apparent contradictions in witness statements. Burke's role in this narrative is as a witness or as an innocent bystander. He is not the active agent. He is the secondary victim, a child traumatized by what happened to his sister, by the presence of an intruder, by the investigative machinery that descended on his family. But this narrative also requires consistency. It requires that Burke not be revealed to have been involved in any way. It requires that his statements, his behavior, his apparent knowledge all be interpreted as consistent with innocence. And when his behavior seems inconsistent, when he's withdrawn, when he's cautious, when he seems to know something, those behaviors must be reframed as trauma responses rather than as indicators of guilt. Patsy's role in maintaining this narrative is crucial. As his mother, she is the primary validator of Burke's innocence. She is the voice asserting that whatever he seems to be holding, it's not knowledge of involvement. She is the one translating his distress into the language of grief and trauma processing. She is the one who can assert, with the authority of a parent, that she has spoken to him about these questions, and he has denied involvement. But there is another dimension to consider. In maintaining this narrative, in asserting her son's innocence so firmly, Patsy is also potentially preventing the emergence of other truths. If Burke is innocent, then certain questions need not be pursued. If the family did not stage the scene, then the staging must have been done by an intruder. If no one in the family did it, then no family members need engage in the kind of detailed self-examination that might reveal uncomfortable truths. Part 12. The limits of knowing what emerges from examining Burke's behavior, his interviews, and the family's response to him is not a clear picture of guilt or innocence. Instead, what emerges is a portrait of a child under extraordinary stress, living in an environment where his possible involvement in his sister's death was an unspoken but persistent question, navigating an investigation that did not have clear boundaries or defined endpoints. Burke was 9 or 10 years old. He had been in his sister's house. He had been present at some point on the morning she died. He had the physical capacity to have done what was done. But capacity and capability are not the same as culpability. And the investigation's focus on him as a person of interest did not resolve the fundamental question. What actually happened? What we know from the interviews and observations is that Burke exhibited signs of significant stress under investigative questioning. He withdrew physically when questions turned to his sister and her death. He was in therapy, apparently processing trauma. He seemed to know something, or to be carrying something. He was not forthcoming in ways that clearly resolved questions about his knowledge or involvement. What we do not know, and what the investigation never definitively established, is whether this stress indicated guilt or whether it indicated something else. The trauma of being a child in a family that had experienced unspeakable loss, the anxiety of being implicated in an investigation by nothing more than proximity and sibling relationship, the developmental limitation of a 9-year-old trying to navigate adult legal and investigative processes, or some combination of these factors. Patsy, as his mother, asserted his innocence firmly. She explained his behavior through the framework of trauma and grief. She maintained that he would tell if he knew something. She positioned him as a victim of the same event that killed his sister, not as a participant in it. But Patsy was also a parent with a stake in her child's innocence. She was someone whose narrative coherence depended on his innocence being real. She was operating within constraints, not allowing him to speak fully without legal representation, not encouraging thorough cooperation with the investigation, not engaging in the kind of deep questioning of her own assumptions that might have revealed uncomfortable possibilities. Part 13. Interview Methodology and Child Psychology. The 3-day interview with Burke in 1998 raises important questions about how law enforcement should approach questioning children in sensitive family investigations. These are not questions of criminal misconduct necessarily, but questions about methodology, appropriateness, and the reliability of information obtained through such processes. A child in Burke's position is operating under multiple competing pressures. He is being asked to recall events from more than a year prior, after those events have been extensively discussed, media covered, and subject to family processing. He is being questioned by official adults in an official capacity, creating power imbalances that make refusal or correction difficult. He understands, at some level, that his answers matter to his family's legal position. He may understand that his mother and father are under suspicion, and that his own statements could bear on their case. Under these conditions, what does a child produce? Reliable memory? Or a reconstruction that incorporates suggestion, meets expectancies, and protects his family? Probably some combination, in ways that are impossible to untangle in retrospect. Tom Haney, the investigator who conducted the interviews, noted the shift in Burke's demeanor on the 3rd day. This observation itself is important because it suggests that the interview process was having an effect on the child, that something about the questions was creating distress. Observing distress and interpreting distress are different things, but the presence of distress in the context of questioning is at minimum a flag for reconsidering methodology. In retrospect, questions emerge about whether a 9-year-old should have been subjected to 3 days of investigative questioning without more robust legal protections. Patsy said she did not speak to him beforehand about specific questions. She said she tried to present it as something positive, a chance to help. But from Burke's perspective, he was being removed from his family and extensively questioned by adults about his sister's death, in an environment where his possible involvement was at least one possible hypothesis. Part 14. The Performance of Normalcy. One of the consistent themes in Patsy's description of Burke is her assertion that he was handling things well. He was adjusting to the move. He was making friends. He was getting good grades. Teachers and counselors said he was doing remarkably well. The therapist said he was fine. These assertions of normalcy are important because they serve a particular psychological function. They position Burke as functioning despite the trauma, as managing despite the investigation, as essentially okay. They suggest that whatever internal distress he might be experiencing, it was not interfering with his basic adaptive functioning. But there is another reading of this performance of normalcy. In a family under investigation, where media attention is constant, where legal jeopardy is present, there is particular pressure on a child to perform normalcy. The family needs Burke to appear untroubled because Burke appearing troubled raises questions. The family needs Burke to be coping well because coping well suggests innocence. The family needs Burke to be making friends and getting good grades because these indicators suggest that he is not harboring dark knowledge or guilt. A 9-year-old is capable of reading these needs. He understands, at some level, that his family needs him to be okay. He can perform okayness even while experiencing distress. This is not intentional deception necessarily. It is a child's adaptive response to the emotional needs of his family system. So when Patsy reports that Burke is doing well, when she notes his good grades and his social adjustment, when she cites his therapist's assessment that he is handling things well, these reports may be accurate observations of his functional presentation, but they do not necessarily tell us about his internal experience. A child can be functionally presenting as normal while internally carrying significant distress, confusion, anxiety, or concern. The performance of normalcy is a form of family protection. If Burke appears normal, then the family appears less broken, less marked by trauma, less implicated in whatever happened to JonBenet. The maintenance of this appearance is important for family coherence and for legal strategy. Part 15. What the body remembers. At the end of his first formal interview, in that fetal position in the chair, Burke's body was communicating something that his words might not have expressed. The body in trauma often remembers things that consciousness has suppressed or that the self has learned to manage at a cognitive level. Whether what Burke's body was remembering was trauma from witnessing his sister's death, anxiety from being interrogated, stress from the weight of his family's legal jeopardy, or something more specific, something connected to his own knowledge or involvement, cannot be determined from the observation alone. What is clear is that Burke, at 9 or 10 years old, was operating under significant psychological stress. He was not a child who was unaffected by the events of December 25, 1996, or by the investigative machinery that had descended on his family. He was a child who had absorbed the trauma, the anxiety, the unanswered questions that permeated his family environment. How that stress manifested in his behavior, in his statements, in what he remembered or forgot or conflated or struggled to express, cannot be definitively separated from the genuine memory and knowledge of events. The psychology of stress, of trauma, of interrogation, all intervene in how a child's knowledge becomes available as testimony or as evidence. Tom Haney observed a child under strain. Patsy reframed that strain as grief processing and trauma response. The investigation never resolved the fundamental question of what that strain meant or what generated it. Part 16. The investigative paradox. Here lies an investigative paradox. Burke's very youth and size made him seem like an unlikely participant in what happened to his sister. A 9-year-old, in most people's understanding, is incapable of doing what was done. Yet his presence in the house, his status as the only other child, made him arithmetically relevant to the investigation's logic. The investigation could not simply dismiss him, but it also could not find evidence that definitively implicated him. He remained, in the logical framework, a person of interest by default, because no one else fit the parameters of the logic better, not because affirmative evidence pointed to him. In this space of logical default relevance, Burke became a focus of speculation, of parental defense, of therapeutic processing. But the investigation never moved from logical possibility to actual evidence. It remained in the realm of hypothesis and conditional reasoning. Patsy's defense of her son made sense within her framework. He was a child. He loved his sister. He had no history of violence. He would tell if he knew something. These are reasonable parental assertions, but they are assertions made from a position of loving advocacy, not from a position of investigative neutrality. What the investigation never successfully established was a coherent alternative narrative that would definitively place Burke outside the circle of possible involvement. The intruder theory was the frame that would achieve that, but the intruder theory had its own evidentiary challenges. So Burke remained suspended in the investigative space, not clearly exonerated, but not clearly implicated. A child traumatized by the investigation itself, perhaps, as much as by the death of his sister. Part 17. Memory and Reconstruction. In thinking about what Burke might or might not have remembered about the morning his sister died, it's important to understand the fragility of children's memory in the context of traumatic events and intensive questioning. Psychological research has documented that children who experience trauma often have fragmented memories of the traumatic event itself. The memory does not lock in with perfect clarity. Instead, it splinters, becomes unreliable, gets filled in with information from other sources, adult conversations, media accounts, information gleaned from friends or teachers. After months and months of his parents discussing the case, of investigators visiting, of media coverage, of therapeutic processing, Burke's memory of the morning of December 25, 1996, would have been substantially reconstructed. What he directly experienced would have been layered over with what he heard, what he absorbed, what he filled in based on narrative logic or expectation. Patsy said she had had extensive conversations with Burke about what happened. She said she had asked him directly whether he knew who did it. She said therapists had explored whether he remembered anything. All of these conversations, intended to help or to establish truth, are also conversations that shape memory, create suggestion, plant narratives. By the time Burke was formally interviewed in 1998, his memory of the morning would not have been pristine. It would have been reconstructed through multiple layers of adult conversation and interpretation. When he was asked to describe what he did, what he saw, what he heard, his answers would have been a blend of genuine memory and reconstructed narrative. The investigation took his statements as evidence, but the statements were also the product of an investigation, shaped by questions asked, by the investigative frame, by the family narrative that had been constructed and reinforced over many months. Part 18. The therapeutic container. That Burke was in therapy during this period is significant. Therapy is presented as supportive, as a place where a child can process trauma, work through emotions, develop coping strategies. And it can be all of those things. But therapy is also a space where narratives are developed and solidified. In therapy, a child learns language for what he is experiencing. He learns frameworks for understanding his emotions and his situation. He develops a coherent narrative about his own psychological state. This narrative becomes stable, reinforced, resistant to alternative interpretations. If the therapeutic narrative was that Burke was a traumatized child who had witnessed or been affected by his sister's death, a narrative of victimhood and grief processing, then that became the frame through which his behavior was understood. His withdrawal became evidence of processing grief. His caution became evidence of internalized threat. His apparent knowledge became evidence that he was wrestling with the trauma of what had happened. But therapy could also potentially obscure other narratives. If a child were being questioned about his possible involvement in something, therapy would be a place where that question might be actively avoided, where the focus would remain on processing trauma rather than on establishing fact. Dr. Jaffe, the therapist, is referenced in the interviews as a source of interpretation and support. But the therapist's perspective, as communicated through Patsy, is always consonant with Burke's innocence. The therapist never reports concerns about Burke's involvement. The therapist only comments on his coping mechanisms, his grief processing, his need to appear strong for his parents. A therapist seeing a child would have certain ethical constraints around reporting suspected abuse or harm. But beyond those constraints, the therapeutic relationship is one of support and advocacy for the child. It is not a neutral investigative space. It is a space where the child's welfare and psychological functioning are the primary concern, not the establishment of forensic facts. Part 19. The weight of being the other sibling. Perhaps the deepest psychological burden Burke carried was simply the burden of being alive when his sister was not. In a family where a child has been killed, The remaining sibling occupies a peculiar position. He is the survivor. He is the one who remains. He carries the weight of being the other one, the still here one, the one whose presence is a daily reminder of the absence. In the aftermath of JonBenet's death, Burke became implicitly responsible for comforting his parents, for carrying the family forward, for managing his own needs so as not to add to his parents' burden. He was in therapy because his parents recognized that this situation exceeded his emotional resources. He was performing normalcy because his family needed him to perform normalcy. He was being questioned because he was the only other person in the house. All of this is the ordinary burden of being a sibling to a dead child in a high-profile case. It is not abuse. It is not malicious. It is the ordinary weight of family trauma, distributed across remaining family members. But what distinguishes Burke's case is the investigative dimension. He was not only grieving his sister, he was also being questioned about his possible involvement. He was not only surviving trauma, he was also implicated by the basic logic of elimination. He was not only carrying his family's grief, he was also carrying the weight of his family's legal jeopardy. In this context, his withdrawal, his caution, his apparent knowledge of something take on a different character. They become not just responses to his sister's death, but responses to a child's understanding that he was under investigation, that his possible guilt was being entertained by the adults around him, that his family's safety might depend on establishing his innocence. Part 20. Testimony and the Limits of Certainty. When Patsy asserted that Burke would tell if he knew something, she was making a claim about the reliability of testimony, about the assumption that a child will report knowledge when asked. This assumption has some intuitive appeal. We expect children to be honest. We expect that if they know something important, they will say so. But psychological research has complicated this assumption considerably. Children can be coached, intentionally or unintentionally. Children can be uncertain about what they know versus what they were told. Children can be motivated to protect parents or family coherence. Children can be confused about what constitutes a memory and what constitutes a reconstruction. Children can be traumatized in ways that prevent clear communication. In Burke's case, even if he had direct knowledge of what happened to his sister, the question of whether and how he would communicate that knowledge is not straightforward. If the event was traumatic, his memory might be fragmented. If his family's coherence depended on a particular narrative, he might be motivated to support that narrative. If he had undergone months of therapeutic processing and family conversation, his original memory might have been substantially reconstructed. Patsy's assertion that Burke would tell is a parent's assertion, made from a position of faith in her child's character. It is not an assertion grounded in investigative or psychological sophistication about the actual mechanisms through which children communicate knowledge in complex family situations. What remains, in the absence of definitive testimony or clear evidence, is an investigative space marked by conditional reasoning, by behavioral observation, by parental assertion, and by the limits of what can be known through questioning a child in an environment already saturated by investigation and family narrative. Part 21. Closure and Uncertainty. The expansion of investigative focus to include Burke, the observation of his stress under questioning, the extensive family discussion about his possible involvement, the therapeutic processing of these questions, all of this created a situation where closure was impossible. The investigation could not definitively exclude Burke. It also could not definitively implicate him. He remained suspended in a zone of investigative uncertainty. For Burke himself, this zone of uncertainty might have been the most damaging aspect of the entire experience. Not the investigation itself, not even the implicit accusation, but the fact that the investigation never resolved. The questions never stopped. The uncertainty never cleared. He was never fully exonerated in a way that would allow him to move beyond suspicion. In this space of unresolved uncertainty, a child who was 9 or 10 years old had to continue growing, developing, becoming a teenager, and then an adult. He carried the weight of an investigation that never concluded, of implicit questions that were never fully resolved, of being the other sibling in a case that defined his family's existence. What happened on that morning in December 1996 was ultimately unknown to everyone outside the family, if, indeed, everyone inside the family knew it clearly. The investigation opened questions about Burke, but never closed them. It created an investigative framework that made his presence relevant, but his role ambiguous. It left him forever implicated by proximity and possibility, if not by evidence. Conclusion. The geometry of doubt. When we step back from the details, from the interviews and observations, from Patsy's defenses and Tom Haney's careful notations, from the therapeutic processing and the family narrative, what emerges is a portrait, not of guilt or innocence, but of uncertainty made visceral. A 9-year-old boy, present in a house where his sister died, observed by investigators to be under significant stress when questioned about her death, his mother asserting his innocence with firmness born of maternal love and family protection. His distress being interpreted variously as grief processing, as trauma response, as the burden of carrying family anxiety, as the stress of interrogation. The investigation could not resolve the fundamental question: what did Burke know? What did he do? Was he involved in any way, intentionally or through accident, in the events that led to his sister's death? These questions remain unanswered. They remain in the domain of conditional reasoning, of logical possibility, of investigative uncertainty. Burke was here. Burke was the only other child. Burke exhibited signs of stress. Burke was questioned. But beyond that, beyond the arithmetic of presence and possibility, the investigation never penetrated. What remains is the weight of these questions themselves, carried forward through decades, bearing on a person who was a child when they were first asked, who had no voice in how he was framed, who had no control over how his stress and his behavior would be interpreted. The investigation left Burke in the position of the silent witness, the implicated bystander, the child whose possible knowledge and possible involvement could never be definitively resolved. In that position of unresolved suspicion, bearing the weight of investigation while carrying the trauma of his sister's death, Burke became another kind of victim. Not of the event itself, perhaps, but of the investigative machinery that could not reach conclusions. This is what the careful examination of behavior and demeanor and interview dynamics reveals. Not answers, but the deep uncertainty that lies at the heart of this case, made manifest in the physical and psychological response of a child under the weight of an investigation that could not be concluded, a knowledge that could not be verified, and a suspicion that could never be fully released.
Freaking Barbara Walters, man. So, when Detective Haney interviewed Burke over 3 days, I think, I don't know if it was Detective Haney. I can't remember who it was. But I think, or it was Commander Eller. I can't really remember. But anyways, I think there was something significant that happened sort of on one of those days, I think, as the questions sort of progressed and they turned specifically to JonBenet and JonBenet's passing. I think they were talking about Burke's physical demeanor shifted quite dramatically. Said he curled into a fetal position. He kind of withdrew, sort of showing clear signs of distress. And I'm trying to lock it down. I guess that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to lock it down. Because Patsy, when she was asked about this, said that Burke was handling things well overall, right? He's doing fine in school. He's making friends. And his therapist comes up and said, oh, yeah, he's coping appropriately with the grief. He's where he's where he needs to be. And he's normal. Even I think it was Patterson. Detective Patterson came back. Was like, oh yeah, it didn't seem like it was holding anything back. It seemed like he was forthcoming. Okay, great. I appreciate you. What I'm not trying to do, I want to be clear about this. What I'm not trying to do is I'm not trying to overinterpret a child's behavior, right? You know, we don't want to do that. We don't want to overinterpret or read into this, that, and the third. We want to be careful of that. So I'm not saying that the fetal position proves that he's guilty of anything. I'm not saying that just because, you know, you show signs of distress that you're guilty of anything. I'm not saying that. But what I'm trying to highlight is the inconsistency of that, to me, I think requires an explanation. Because you can't simultaneously be fine and deeply distressed at the same time. You cannot be calm and collected during sort of this general interview. We're just kicking tires, ask questions, and then sort of like physically collapse when you're asked a specific question about your sister without us being like, what's going on here? I think personally part of the problem with how we talk about children in these situations is that we infantilize them, right? We act like because they're our babies, they're unaware. We act like they don't understand what's happening around them, which is very much what Patsy and John tried to do. Oh, Burke doesn't know. He doesn't understand. Yeah, you know, but children are psychologically sophisticated. They pick up on parental anxiety easy. They tend to absorb. That's why we talk about caregiving is so important, because children tend to absorb the tension in their home. They understand when they can understand when they're the focus of the investigation, even if they don't have like the vocabulary or the legalese to sort of articulate that. Look, I was watching videos. I was just scrolling social media and I was watching some videos and it looked like this girl was like 5 or 6, maybe even younger. Her dad said something to her, right? Her dad leaned over and said something to her. And I guess he had bad breath. His breath stank. And so his daughter looked at him and she was like, I'm talking about a kid. She looked at him and she said, do you brush your teeth every day? He was like, what? And he said, what? And she said, do you brush your teeth every day? And obviously got the message that his breath stunk. Kids understand, their face tunes up because they have the real feelings, the real emotions that, yo, your breath stinks. You know what I mean? Even if they don't have I'm not going to say what it was, but another child, you know, her mom was kind of dressing her or something like that. And she basically said, did you take a bath? And her mom was like, what are you talking about? Because her mom was just kind of standing in front of her doing her hair. She's like, did you take a bath? And she was like, what are you talking about? Of course I did. She was like, so why does your butt stink? And she was like, what? She's like, why does your butt stink? Right. And so kids are very well aware, you know, and it wasn't the woman's butt. It was something else. But her daughter noticed that, like, yo, this is the language that I got, but it stinks. So I'm trying to figure out how to tell you that it stinks. Kids can be very direct and very honest with their feelings. Even if you just want to come in and bring Burke in and sit with him, it's incredibly crucial. It's absolutely critical and necessary that we get him in here. Can you tell us everything you know, even with your parents? I don't think BPD would have had a problem with that. Like, just, bring him in. We want to talk to him with you guys here. It will be great to have everybody here at the same time. We can just kind of talk to everybody and see, what the deal is. Right? But instead, John and Patsy, if we operate under the intruder theory, assumed that Burke didn't know anything and kept him away and said he doesn't know anything, so therefore you shouldn't be able to talk to him. Yeah, but what if he does? Yeah, but, and I know Detective Patterson said he had a chance to talk to him for a little bit, but it's like, that was a quick talk before we knew a lot of this stuff. And it didn't seem like he knew much at the time, right? Fair. But also, there may be some questions and some line of questioning that we're not asking right now. And so, of course, he has no reason to be defensive or look anything other than normal and calm. But as we can see in the Commander Eller interview, he got this shifting and shaking and doing all this and that and looking up and, I don't think I'm supposed to. Yeah. Burke was 9 years old. I think he understood that his sister was dead, and he understood that police were investigating, right? Police come in. Burke is 9. He's intelligent. If you just listen to Burke talk, you can tell he's intelligent. He's not oblivious. Burke, I'm going to tell you his personality type. Burke is very observant. He might not say anything about it, but he's very observant. He watches. Man, I was going to do some analysis on Burke when he was, and maybe I will at some other time, but I was looking at some videos, I think, on social media. I think Cotton Star may have shared them of his time at the Crime Con. I think it was Crime Con. And I think Burke was just like looking around. He was looking around, looking everywhere. He was scanning. You could tell that he's being hyper aware that there are eyes on him from everywhere, right? And from what it looked like Burke couldn't even pay attention to the person that was talking to him and was standing in front of him for trying to keep an eye on somebody else who might have had their eyes on him. And I was like, why do you seem so nervous? Calm down. What's with that? Oh, I would be nervous too if people were always trying to blah, 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 blah. I mean, if you were legitimately clear, let me tell you something. John Andrew don't seem nervous. John Andrew wasn't even there. John Andrew's like just going about his business. I mean, yeah, this is what I believe, so on and so forth, blah, 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 da, 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 da. So why would you seem nervous? And I'm not saying that he can't be nervous. Absolutely be nervous. Knock yourself out. Be as nervous as you want to be. Shake, wiggle, jiggle, whatever. Shiver. Absolutely. Be as nervous as you want to be. I'm not, when you can't, fine. I'm just saying Burke is very observant. He knows things. So when you talk to him in these interviews and some of the ways that he talks, let me tell you something. When he was describing the process for how he got into the window, when his dad broke the window and such as that, it was like, yeah, no, very directly, I would go here, dad would come through, we'd do this, that, and the third, blah, blah, blah. He knows, and quite intriguing to see him describe that process of John coming through the window, going through unlocking, and then coming in and understanding completely. At 10 years old, I believe he was. 9, 10 to describe that process, maybe a little bit older, but to be able to describe that process, and to sort of recollect with pinpoint accuracy, I think, and be certain and definitive in kind of speaking about that. So I say that to say that he understood that the question of what happened to JonBenet was open, right? And maybe he would have been open to answering that more or sort of, I guess, speaking to that more at length, had investigators had a little bit more time to question him and had an open dialogue, right? I think that he understood at some level that he was relevant, whether it was him or not. I think he understands at some level that he's relevant to the investigation simply because he's the only other child in the house. And I think that, in the book, The Death of Innocence, it was either in the book, The Death of Innocence, or The Other Side of Suffering, that John talks about how when he got Burke up, he brought Burke down, and Burke went over to talk to Patsy, and Burke started crying and kind of sent him on his way, and then he went to Fleet White's house, and then later on, and I guess he didn't know what was going on. I don't know if that was the case. I don't know why he would be crying then at the house, but Patsy comforted him and sent him on his way, if I remember the details correctly. And so he goes on about his way. And once he gets to the whatever house that they're settling in, John comes back and says, "Hey, by the way, your sister's in heaven." And I think Burke immediately understands what that means, and he sheds a tear. Right? He knows what it means. He knows what's going on. And so what we see here is John is sort of giving Burke what he thinks Burke can handle. And Patsy and John are giving Burke what they think he can handle by saying, look, we will tell you when and what's happening, but the cops cannot come in and question. We're going to hide you and shield you so they don't expose you to some things. Even when we talk about Burke seeing how Patsy and John talk about Burke seeing his face on tabloids, cue the tabloids, I guess, on tabloids, talking about his relation to what happened to his sister. And you can see Patsy she is broke up. But the tabloids and Burke just kind of seeing that and just falling apart. Like, oh my God, that's about me. Oh, so you know what that means. They're attacking you. Funny, because your parents don't seem to think that you know what's going on, even though they tried to shield you and hide you and act like you don't know what's going on. Somehow, some way, with all the shielding and the hiding, you know exactly what's going on. And you know that this is far more complex and complicated than your parents are telling you. Babe, it's nothing. Yeah, don't worry about it. But you see a tabloid, he's like, what's that mean? Oh, man, they're trying to blame it on me. What? Blame what? Oh, man. Burke is very well aware. You'd be surprised what your kids run up on. And I think one explanation is possibly that the thought of his sister is genuinely painful. Maybe he feels uncomfortable. There's some reasons for this uncomfortableness. But the thought of his sister, obviously, fair enough. The first thing we would jump at is that the thought of his sister is genuinely painful. And sort of grief expresses itself in different ways at different moments, blah, 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 blah. We get all that. Maybe he is compartmentalized. It's the way that he's one way in part of the interview and in another way in the other part of the interview. And it's possible that maybe he can function in certain contexts and then becomes overwhelmed in others. That would make sense. I would put Patsy in that category. She is functioning well, but there are times to which she needs to take a break, take a step back. So I would understand that. And so these are all legitimate interpretations, but I think possibly another explanation is that it could be the case that sometimes distress isn't about grief. Sometimes distress isn't about grief. Maybe there's distress related to the investigation. I'm just, the pressure of sort of being questioned, and maybe I know something about something and I'm carrying that weight on me. And so that weight of maybe knowing something becomes present when the focus, everything else is fine, right? But when the focus turns to my sister, we could talk about pizza all day long. But when the focus turns to my sister, I don't know if I want to go there. You know what I mean? I'm not saying which interpretation is correct. I'm just saying we have to pay attention to this inconsistency, right? And the fact that you have the parents, you have the therapists explain it away as grief processing. They explain it away as an appropriate coping mechanism, sort of as evidence that he was handling it well. I think that explanation doesn't tell us everything. So in one part of the interview, when you are fine, absolutely fine, say for example like John, we would expect that demeanor to last all the way through, right? That demeanor goes all the way through because John is not going to cry. John is not going to break down. That's just not who John is. Patsy, we know that Patsy's going to show up. Her face is going to be red. She's going to be on edge. She's going to be mad. She's going to be ticked off. You can look at her face right now. Patsy is on edge. You can't say the wrong thing to Patsy. Patsy is already on edge. Anything could set Patsy off. She does not like this situation. She's sitting with her hands together, kind of, and you can see that her shoulders are kind of hunched in a little bit because she's uncomfortable talking about this topic because she knows that anything could pop up and catch me off guard. That's consistent. We know that any point in time, Patsy could be overwhelmed and she could start crying. That's consistent. But when you're like, oh, yeah, if you have a psychologist that's like, yeah, he's operating consistently through, nothing happened. And from what we can see on the screen, Burke isn't like, he doesn't like shapeshift, I guess was what I'm looking for. His attitude doesn't shapeshift on the screen when we think about his interaction with the psychologist. Not only that, but with Dr. Phil. It's consistent. So it's just like, I don't see any. But when we see you go in the early days, when we see you go from calm, fine, all of a sudden to rolling up in the fetal position, the fetal position is a position to protect yourself. When you get into the fetal position, you're trying to bind everything together and to hold yourself and create a ball of protection. Even if you're crying about something different, I'm trying to create a ball and a circle of protection around me. That's what the fetal, or if somebody is attacking me, I'm trying to protect and roll up and keep from being attacked. That's what the fetal position does. If you're cold, I roll up in the fetal position to try to gain warmth. The fetal position isn't something that people just sit in. Think about it. When have you ever just been sitting in the fetal position just to be sitting in the fetal position? Every time you see somebody and you ask them, why are you in the fetal position? Because I'm cold. I don't know, because I like sitting like this. Nobody just sits in the fetal position. It's comfortable. When you sitting straight and then you go into the fetal position, when I ask you about something, it's very similar to when the detective was like, hey, What about this snack? And Burke kind of looked at him. Did JonBenet like pineapple? And Burke was like, JonBenet likes everything. I'm sure that is the case. But that's not what I asked you. I asked you very specifically, does she like pineapple? That's all. Because if I see pineapple on the table, I want to I want to understand whether or not it's accurate. Because pineapple could be sitting on the table and it could be related to nothing. That could legitimately be, maybe the intruder was like, yo, I want some pineapple too. Sat down to eat some pineapple and it's like, you know what? Time's up. Can't eat all the pineapple. I got to get up and go. I thought I had time. I don't have time. Got to get up and go. But when I look at you in your face and I say, what about this pineapple? What, that's something that you guys enjoy? And you look at me like I asked you the wrong question. It's not a big deal. And that's what I'm saying. We keep on running to these things that should not be a big deal, like you turning over your paycheck stubs. Shouldn't be a big deal. If they're out for the world to see anyway, just give them to me. Right? But I got to wait for it. There's always a hesitation, always a reason why you can't give me a straight answer. I'm just trying to solve the case for you. I'm trying to help you out. Help me help you. I'll let you get back to the video.